This week's Yoga Talk Show is brought to you by Four Sigmatic. Four Sigmatic is a nutritional supplement company that specializes in medicinal mushrooms, and they make these really cool packets that you can make into basically mushroom coffee or mushroom tea. It's meant to replace your morning coffee or your morning tea, and the ones I particularly like are cordyceps and lion's mane. We had the founder of Four Sigmatic on the show a couple of years ago, you might remember. Really great company. They use fruiting bodies, not just mycelium. They use non-chemical extractions, so you get lots of beta-glucans, lots of terpenoids, and you get all the healing properties of mushrooms without all the gas and bloating that you often get with mushroom products that you'll find in the pharmacy or in your nutritional store locally. As a sponsor of the show, they've offered listeners a 15% discount. Go to foursigmatic.com/yogabody. That's foursigmatic, all spelled out, foursigmatic.com/yogabody. And use coupon code YOGABODY when you check out, and you'll save 15%. Again, the ones I like are cordyceps and lion's mane, but you'll find a whole bunch of other cool products you might want to check out as well. Thanks to Four Sigmatic for supporting the show. If you look at the things in life that will cost you the most money, it's your education, it's your home, and it's your health. And health is usually the number one expense for people over the course of their life, and it tends to be the most expensive at the end of their life when they have the least amount of money. The money, I would argue, is the least of the cost to your time, the cost to your health span, the cost to your quality of life is even more detrimental than the one to your pocketbook. So how do we mitigate that? On the Yoga Talk Show, we explore all kinds of different ways, from meditation and breathing exercises to diet nutrition, but a fundamental concept that can be really boiled down into a few words is movement is medicine, and modern life involves very little movement. Most people go through an entire day without extending their arms above their head. Most people never squat all the way down in the course of an entire day. Our movement patterns are so limited and so restricted. People are walking 1,000 steps a day, never squatting, never doing anything that would resemble a back bend or a twist, and this is not natural. There's all kinds of things that happen when you don't move, but here's some of the positive things that happen when you do move. Studies at University of British Columbia in Canada, studies at Harvard have all confirmed that regular aerobic exercise, which just basically means when your heart is up over an extended period of time, will actually boost the size of your hippocampus, your brain, and your prefrontal cortex. And these are areas involved in verbal memory, in learning, attention, and mood. So you can work better, you feel better, you're happier, your brain is bigger. Literally, it makes more brain cells. The reason I think that's important to emphasize is because for academic nerdy people like myself, we tend to think of physical movement as something superficial, something that's aiming towards just looking good in the mirror, which maybe we don't value as much as having high cognitive function. But the reality is they are one and the same. So the stronger your body is, the more physically fit you are, the stronger your brain is. There's a direct correlation between the two. And if we look at all-cause mortality, neurodegenerative illnesses way up high on the list, often number 2 or number 3, number 4 at the very least. These are things like dementia and Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative conditions, and exercise is one of the simplest ways to combat that. When you say aerobic exercise, people usually conjure up images of some kind of cheesy 1980s group fitness thing bouncing around, and maybe that's what you like. I kind of like that stuff too. But it could also be a strong yoga class. It could also be a CrossFit workout. It could be a cycling class. It could be a brisk walk around the block with your dog every day. We, the sort of traditional fitness enthusiasts, throw things into either aerobic or anaerobic, sort of running or weightlifting, but it's a lot more complex than that. At your average functional fitness gym today, even when people are lifting weights, they're often doing it in high-intensity interval circuits or some kind of circuit training where people's heart rate is staying elevated for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes plus. So while it might look like Olympic lifting, or it might look like kettlebells, it might look like wall balls or squats or whatever it is, if you actually look at the heart rate, some of those anaerobic looking fitness routines are actually quite aerobic as well. So the line in the sand between resistance training and aerobic training is often one we don't need to draw. In yoga class as well, especially a strong athletic class or a class in the heat, people's heart rate, and I know this because I've measured student, will often stay elevated throughout the entire class. I'd encourage you to get to know your heart rate, get to know how your heart responds to things like your Thursday evening yoga class, your CrossFit box class, your cycling class, your walk around the block and your run, so you can get an idea about what it does, how it reacts, and how you can encourage more of that elevated heart rate workout throughout your week. When you look at the studies, most of the studies, none of the studies suggest you should be an Ironman athlete or a triathlete or an ultramarathoner. In fact, most of the studies show those are pretty detrimental to your health. You are aging yourself at an accelerated pace when you push yourself that hard. Generally, what most of the studies recommend is around 120 minutes per week of exercise. So that might be 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week. That might be less, right? It might be 20 minutes a day, 6 days a week, all kinds of different ways you could spread it out. But moderate is really the key. If you look at centenarians, if you look at people who live the longest in the world, there's a couple things that you'll note. The first is that they're not doing a whole lot. They're certainly not at CrossFit Games. They're certainly not at hot yoga every day. They're pretty much just random general people who have a genetic lottery and also have some generally relatively healthy patterns, and movement is usually part of that, but it's never super hardcore movement. Other benefits of exercise that are often overlooked, probably one of the biggest reasons to exercise, is not for calorie burning, but for endocrine system modulation, hormonal balance. Some of the big ones that we talk a lot about are insulin resistance, which is essentially, you could think of it as poor blood sugar, poor sugar metabolism is a simple way to think about it. Your body can't really handle sugar very well anymore. And so the same chocolate cake that gave you energy and made you run around as a kid now just goes straight to your hips. That is when your body, after decades and decades of getting bombarded with sugar, has now become resistant to insulin, and a lot more insulin is needed to do the same job as less was needed before. And so your body's basically very efficient at storing fat. Exercise increases your sensitivity to insulin, which increases your body's ability to process and manage the sugar you're getting nailed with every day. Exercise also reduces systemic inflammation, which would be measured by something like C-reactive protein tests in your blood panel that you might get from your doctor. If you don't get blood panels, I'd encourage you to start getting them. Both insulin resistance and inflammation are correlated with pretty much every degenerative disease you could imagine, from neurodegenerative diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's to all the metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes and obesity and all these kinds of heart disease. All of these things are directly correlated with inflammation and insulin resistance. So in many ways, one of the most high leverage things you can do for your health is to get around and start moving. Again, this is nothing new, but it's important you put it in the context of what you're really trying to do, which is not necessarily look great in the mirror. That's a really nice side benefit if that happens to occur. But much more importantly, you're trying to take care of your body from the inside out. You're trying to balance your hormones. You are trying to give your brain what it needs. You're trying to increase the size of that hippocampus and prefrontal cortex and really take care of yourself long term. We have a tendency to compartmentalize exercise in our life, where exercise means going to the gym for 20 minutes on the elliptical machine and 20 minutes hanging off some weight machines, and we call it a day. I'd encourage you to be a little more creative with your movement and try to cross-train in the most loose and relaxed way possible, meaning take the stairs sometimes, go for a walk during your lunch break, park your car far away from the grocery store. Do things so that you move more often. Do them deliberately, do them shamelessly, and do it knowing full well that just like eating a healthy meal, moving, squatting, lifting your arms above your head, that's taking care of your body from the inside out. And the trickle down, the downstream benefits of that are really pronounced. On this week's Yoga Talk Show, we will meet an Olympic athlete, a former Olympic athlete, who shares how movement was absolutely medicine for him in his life. It also became his livelihood, his career, and his legacy. I think you'll learn a lot from it. Your questions, comments, and feedback are always most welcome. Email me, podcast@yogabuddy.com. I also like voicemail, yogabuddy.com/Ask Lucas. So hello and welcome everyone. This is Lucas Rockwood with the Yoga Talk Show. Thanks for tuning in. Today's show is called Movement as Medicine, and I am joined here with Leon Taylor. Leon started swimming and gymnastics from the age of 2, and he picked up competitive diving when he was just 8. By the age of 11, he was national champion. He represented Great Britain at 3 Summer Olympics Games, and he was a member of the Great Britain team for 16 full years. Among his many awards and medals, he won the bronze in the 1999 European Aquatics Championship. He won silver at the men's 10-meter platform in the 2002 Commonwealth Games. In 2004 Olympics in Athens, he won a silver medal in men's synchronized 10-meter platform. And in 1998, he actually invented what was then considered the world's most difficult dive. Leon now works as a public speaker, a presenter, a conference host, a BBC commentator, and a mentor to members of the British team. He wrote a book called Mentor. You can learn about his book and all of his work at his site, leontaylor.co.uk. Leon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lucas. Thanks for having me.
I understand you struggled a lot as a kid with behavior and attention. Was this your whole life, or did it kick in at age 5, or when did it start?
Oh, wow. No, the story starts before I could even remember. So the reason that I ended up involved in so many physical activities is because my poor parents didn't know what to do with me. I've told the story many times, but, even now at this age, my mum and dad still refer to me as a pain in the backside. And that's pretty much how I started. As soon as I was born, I had a pretty traumatic birth and subsequently wouldn't sleep, needed constant attention. My mum and dad, as soon as I was born, figured out that there was something not quite right, and they had to start sleeping in shifts in order to kind of manage me. Bless them. So no, right from the word get-go, it was a struggle, and it seems that my parents managed eventually to notice that if I was engaged in something that required me to move, so whether that was climbing over cushions on the floor when I was learning to crawl, or as I started to walk, running around the living room in the house, constantly moving but engaging with other human beings, namely my mum and dad, because I was a bit too much of a handful for everyone else, it seemed. That was when I was most engaged, and they almost could try and rely on that physical movement to tire me out, and then maybe, just maybe, they could get a rest.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kids are so unique. I have 2 kids, and my daughter was just an angel when she was little. She would go to sleep at 8, wake up at 8, and my son sounds a lot like you. From the moment he was born, he would sleep. A big night for him would be 5 hours in total. No naps. No naps. I have one picture that I hold very dear, which was when he was about 3 years old. He fell asleep once in the middle of the day playing, and I was just overwhelmed with joy, because it was the first time, and he, all the pictures of him before the age of 4, he has black circles under his eyes. He's completely sleep deprived, just total insomniac. He would claw at me. He usually had scratches on my face. He was just completely wired differently than any other child I'd ever met. And he's really changed dramatically over the years. And same kind of thing. Sports and movement were not his thing and are not his thing. He loves to play and things like that. But he's just found different ways to channel his energy. And now he's just a complete joy and pleasure to be around. But it's really interesting how quick educators and therapists were to label. He got labeled with all kinds of different things. You go down the list of all the things that were quote unquote wrong with him, and then you meet him today, and he's 7 years old, and he actually seems quite gifted. And clearly, you were gifted as well. And so I guess were and are. And so my question for you is: when your parents were seeking help, what kinds of things were they being told, and how did they figure out how to interpret that?
Yeah, so it was a very typical story. So I was firstborn, and so my mum and dad didn't have anyone to compare me to. Certainly, I seemed unique when they looked further afield to their friends and family. So they took me to the family doctor, primarily to see if he could offer any help. And, they were faced with the conversation of, okay, well, if you can't cope with and I was labeled as a problem child. I don't think ADHD and various other labels had been whether they'd been created or whatever by then. So the label of a problem child, because that's how my behavior was interpreted. And they were offered, various drug interventions in order to sedate me, primarily so they could get some rest. And at that time, my father in particular, pretty much walked out of the doctor's surgery saying, we're not going down that road. And that was a firm decision that he made. And they, attempted to find other ways to get, some rest so they could cope, because it was really, really tough for them. So they thought maybe other people could help. And so my aunties and uncles and extended family and friends, were in the beginning very, happy to attempt to look after me. And quickly that faded away. And my mum and dad were left at the end of the tether going, holy moly, we can't cope with, Leo. No one else can cope with him. He's, what can we do? And that was the decision. They said, okay, let's do our best, to tire him out. We know that he likes to move. let's get him involved in everything. And in your lovely introduction, you mentioned swimming and gymnastics, which were, I started those way before I can remember. So I used to love, splashing in the bath, as lots of youngsters do. But as soon as I went to the local swimming pool where there's the children's area, I came alive. And so mum and dad were like, okay, how often can we get down here? And so they were kind of coordinating their days, in order to make sure that, I could spend as much time splashing around in the water as possible. And at that same time, there was an activity, mother and baby gymnastics, which is exactly as it sounds. So the youngsters, the babies are there. They got the movement patterns. I'm 8 months old, I think. When you start to roll around on the floor, and then eventually that turns into the next level, which I believe over here in the UK is called tumble tots, which is as it sounds. And of course, I was amazing in those environments. I mean, I was difficult to manage. I needed constant guidance, my attention. I would if I was left to my own devices, I would start doing my own thing, and that would often involve being quite boisterous with the other attendees, which of course had its own challenges. But these activities and these opportunities to move, and ultimately that kind of turned into a bit more of a structured thing of what we would know as sport. But certainly in the beginning days, it was just being really, really physical. And mum and dad found that I became easier to manage as I got older, and also as my communication skills started to develop, I was able to say what was wrong. So in the early days, as any baby, you've only got one response, one option, which is you're either quiet or you're screaming, so it seems. And I was the latter all the time. So it was nice when I was able to start to communicate with my parents and really start to say, what I wanted. And it was always, I want to run around, basically. And that was when I was at my happiest. And ultimately, my parents got a lot of joy out of that eventually.
Medication versus non-medication intervention is always a really challenging thing. It's not just for kids, for adults as well, depending on where you are in the world. In the US, as many as 1 in 5 people are on some kind of mood modulator, whether it's an antidepressant or something like this. And so it's really a ton of people who are taking these things, and I've taken things in my life, and I hope to not take them again. But it's a really challenging thing to try to figure out when medication makes sense and when it doesn't. And it's really difficult to everyone wants to say like only natural, or, put the kids, if the kid's diagnosed with ADHD, put them on Adderall or Ritalin or whatever it is. But there's so much nuance to that. And I remember, I've never had a really great relationship with medical doctors, only just because I haven't had much experience with them. But I had a family doctor when I was about 16, 17 years old. And I went in and I got diagnosed as ADD. And, I was really having trouble focusing. Reading was always a big challenge for me. I just couldn't seem to follow a line with my eyes. By the end of one line, I was gone somewhere else. I always did really well in school, but the attention thing was really a problem. And so I went to the family doctor hoping to get referred to a psychiatrist. And, he said, yeah, you probably have ADD. And so he's like, what do you want to do with this? And, I said, well, I heard there's medication. He said, well, you have a couple of options here, you have ADD, probably that's true. And so we could get you on Ritalin. That was kind of the drug of choice at the time. Or you could figure out some other way. If you go on Ritalin, that's probably for life. Do you really want to be on speed for the rest of your life? And I thought like, wow, that's a doctor really doing their job well.
That is.
Wasn't saying yes or no. He's just saying like, let's talk about this for what this is. These are strong amphetamines. And are you going to take these for the rest of your life, or are you going to figure out how to deal with this challenge? And it was just a really interesting reframing of a question. And for me, I was super high functioning. I was getting good grades. I had friends. I was not getting in trouble at school, everything. So why would I put myself on amphetamines? And yet a number of my friends were already on them. And, what does that, is that right or wrong? I don't know. But it's certainly a question that I think more of us need to ask. I'm feeling down. I'm feeling depressed. Do I really need to take Xanax? Do I really need to take some kind of SSRI? Or do I just need to try jumping off a diving board, try CrossFit, try yoga, try meditation, try breathing? And I guess what interests me about your story is how do any parents channel kids into high-level athletics? I mean, clearly you started really young, but it's always kind of a mystery to me how people go. I have a family, friend of my kids. One of their kids is a really high level skier, and I live here in Barcelona. And there's no snow. The nearest mountain is 2.5 hours away, so it's really challenging to get a kid into high level skiing. And I just always wonder, how does this happen? I mean, clearly you had this movement, this tendency towards movement, but how did your parents channel that and really help you to go as far as Olympic athlete, which is the peak of athletic performance? How does that happen?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. I think I have lots of people who I'm close to who are Olympians, Paralympians. I'm fortunate now to work with many who are the next generation in my role as a mentor, and everyone has a unique backstory. And so for me, it was I think there's a lot about luck. I had potential, certainly. Genetically, I have a normal and a higher amount of fast twitch muscles than the general population, which means that would bode well for jumping high. So with no jump training, I can jump higher than most of the general population. But we didn't know that when I was at 8 and I started diving. What we did know is that I was very, very driven by things I enjoyed. And my mum and dad just created an opportunity for me to try things lots of the time, and they would be happy for me to try new things and shut things I wasn't enjoying down. So I pretty much, through my parents' sacrifice, tried every sport that was available to me in the local area that I lived in. Now, there were many sports that weren't available to me, but the ones that I tried, I quickly, soccer, massively, hugely popular over here. And my dad, was a huge soccer fan, so he was delighted when he was thinking, great, look at all this energy my son has. Maybe, he's going to be the next name of footballer, soccer player. But of course, I went off to, football and hated it. I didn't seem to have the coordination required. And as soon as my attention was like, I don't like that, then that was like a mule. There was no way I was going to go and engage. But the other activities, the gymnastics, the diving, as soon as I started, I was like, wow, this is interesting. And not interesting as in, it was just like whoop, my hyper focus, if you will, kind of came in. And luckily for me, there was a facility, a very humble facility. I was able to take lessons, and then that turned into, I joined the club and happened to be a volunteer coach who was of a certain level, was able to, hone my skills in the early days. And then because I started to succeed at a local area, so in the club circuit in the county, and then the district, and then eventually at national level. So by the time I was 11 years old, I was competing at the national championships in 3 different sports because I was very fortunate to have those sports serviced, if you will, in my small town in the west of the UK in a county called Gloucestershire, my hometown of Cheltenham Spa, which is more famous for the horse racing than it is for anything else. And so I wasn't lucky enough to fall into or be born into a city where there was a high performance training center. I was lucky enough to fall into a city where there were these sports that I tried. And then ultimately, as you start to climb the ladder, you then start to make decisions. And ultimately, after I finished my formal education at 18, I then had to decide whether I was going to go to university in the States. I had the opportunity to get a full scholarship there and compete for the university, the collegiate system out there. But at the same time, there was a change in the structure of British sport, where funding was starting to come in, and the opportunity to really take your performance and professionalism to the next level came in. And luckily for me, and there's that word again, luck, my timing of my career meant that I was 18 in 1996, I went to my first Olympic Games, and then the landscape of the sport in the UK changed dramatically. So in Atlanta in 96, Team GB placed 36 on the medal table. There was a massive overhaul of the funding structure of British sport, and then ultimately Team GB have gone up and up on the medal table. So 4 years later we were 11th, and then in Athens when I won my Olympic silver medal we were in the top 10, and then we've been up there in the top 4 ever since. And that's because of the change of the landscape. And I timed my career, if you will, perfectly, but of course I didn't time it at all, because I was lucky to be here at this time.
And so when you started getting into swimming and gymnastics, but swimming in particular, did it help with your behavior? Did it help with school? Or was it just kind of a place where you had to channel things?
Yeah, so it did help with my behaviour and with school because, people and my girlfriend now of 8 years often, refers to me as, in the nicest possible way, as a dog. So I need exercising and I need feeding. And if both of those things are done, then I'm a joy to be around. But it's like, so my parents learned very quickly that if I had that outlet, then, I was able to, maintain a level of behaviour that was manageable for me and for everywhere I was at, including the school. I mean, it was more challenging when I was younger because the instruction from the teacher was sit still, which of course I couldn't do, concentrate, which I found very, very difficult, and often other instances like don't speak or don't move or certain things. So it was very, very challenging, the talk and chalk methodology of teaching. I needed to be moving more. But my parents did a great thing. They very much did a great job of disciplining me, knowing that my sporting activities were most important to me. They would gently suggest that if I didn't put 100% effort, they weren't interested in grades, but they were interested in my application, which is the right way of going about it, as I've learned subsequently. But certainly for them, they were interested in the amount of effort and concentration and determination I was putting into my work rather than the grades. And they would gently suggest that if I was in trouble at school for not fulfilling those commitments and concentration and effort, then they would take away my privileges. And they did a few times. So they wouldn't let me go to training or a competition because of my behavior at school. So that then encouraged me to pay more attention there. So I thank them for that as well. So as I got older, once again, similar story, I was able to apply myself, and then I've continued all the way through education to university level, which of course I couldn't complete because I was competing so much. So I've subsequently had to pick up on my education over the years.
Swimming is a unique sport. I don't know much about diving, but I swam as a kid, and to this day, I have very distinct memories, all the way back to age 9, age 12, age 15, what it felt like after swim practice. And I never was very athletic, never was competitive, but I swam a lot. I'd swim hour and a half practice, 4 days a week, this kind of thing. And it's the only real movement practice that I can compare to yoga in terms of the breath work that it involves. And grew up as an anxious kid, definitely an anxious person now. Yoga calms me down, but swimming had and has that same effect, and something that people don't really talk about enough. And I'm curious, if you've experienced in actual pool training, if you've experienced that with yourself or other people, or if you have any thoughts about sort of the mind-body benefits of a breath synchronized practice.
Yeah, I certainly do. I mean, it's worth us talking about yoga as well, if I may, because for me, when the medical team who were looking after me, made up of all of the amazing practitioners you could imagine, told me in 2008, after 4 reconstructive shoulder surgeries, a worn-out disc in my lower back, and hernia surgery, that the Beijing Olympic Games were not going to happen, and that the reality was, if I was a horse, they'd have to shoot me. They actually made that statement, and it was, there was some truth in it, but they needed to grab my attention, which they certainly did. And at the age of 30, I was in chronic pain, specifically in my lower back. And one of the suggestions that they made at that time was to try something like yoga in order to rebalance my unbalanced body. I'd been training in a specific way, 7 hours a day, 6 days a week, in high performance sport for so long that I'd put myself in a very, very dangerous place. And they said, if you don't do something, then in 10 years' time, you're going to be in a lot worse place and, potentially struggling to walk and such like. So that's when this word yoga was presented to me. And before then, I had no idea really what it was. I had, contrived ideas of what it might be. But shortly after that conversation, I took my first yoga class. It was a heated yoga. It was, a friend suggested it. She said, it's going to kick your backside, it's going to kick your ass. And I was like, oh, great. That sounds like just the type of activity that I want to do. And the first class was super tough. And then very quickly I was like, right, I'm into this. And the most beautiful thing happened, because after 6 months of practicing yoga, if I could, daily, so 90-minute classes in the heat, at the minimum, I was in and out of London a lot, so I was traveling a bit. So maybe some weeks only 3 classes, but almost without me knowing, 6 months down the line after retiring, I suddenly realized that my lower back no longer hurt, which was amazing. So that was the first time in well over 5 years. But the other thing that I realized, and this was the beautiful, subtle joy of practicing yoga, was I found myself the calmest I'd ever been. As a high-level athlete, everything needs to be done at least by yesterday. You're self-centered in all of your choices and behaviors. You're obsessive, you're compulsive, you're pushing, And I suddenly realized that, when people were late to meet me, I wasn't getting annoyed. Or when there was a traffic jam, I wasn't so on edge. And it was like this moment of realization. I was like, this is the yoga practice. And then for me, that was where my curiosity peaked, because I listened to the teachers talking about the breath and the movement. And I realized that in all of my sporting endeavors, and yoga isn't a sport, but in all of my movement endeavors before, I totally ignored the breath because I was just doing it and swimming as fast as I can. I wasn't paying attention to it. This was the first time I'd slowed down and synchronized my movement with my breath, and it had the most profound effect on my overall well-being.
Let's take a quick break from our show to thank this week's sponsor, Four Sigmatic. Four Sigmatic makes the highest quality medicinal mushroom beverages on the market. Instead of nutritional supplements like capsules or pills, they make these really cool sachets that you put into a glass of hot water. Yoga Body listeners get 15% off. Go to foursigmatic.com. That's all spelled out, foursigmatic.com/Yoga Body. And when you check out, use code YOGABODY as a coupon code, and you'll save 15% on your order.
Profound effect on my overall well-being, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, whatever that means to me at the time and means to me now. But it was incredible. And so now, I'm also, like you are, a yoga teacher, because I was so inspired in that moment to share the practice of yoga in all its entirety. I needed to know more, and that's when I started my journey to become a teacher and to share my story of how I found myself there. And now, to answer your question, when I'm swimming, I now swim for fun. I do triathlons. I took on an Ironman as a challenge this year, which was a huge challenge. But my swim training was very, very different, and that awareness of the breath carries with me now into all my other movement activities.
And how did you transition from kind of professional athleticism training routine, which I'm guessing was like 4 to 6 hours a day of training? How do you transition into civilian life, and what does that look like in terms of, like, what was your regime like when you were training professionally, and what is your regime like these days?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So at this peak, I was training 7 hours a day, because diving is made up of so many different components. I was in the weights room, I was working with physios, I was doing Pilates type movements. Then you're in the dry land diving area, which is trampolines and various other, mats and boxes to somersault off. And then, of course, you've got the pool where all of the skills need to break down onto low diving boards and all the way up to in my case, the 10-meter diving board. And then it's a bumpy ride when you get spat out of the other end after professional high-performance sport. And for me, I was fortunate that I'd seen... early on in my career, I had a career-ending injury which didn't end my career, but it suddenly rocked me to realize that I needed to be a little bit more aware. I had all of my chips, in one place. I needed to spread them, and therefore I started to find, other areas of interest. And so I work now, as you've mentioned, for the BBC. I was very interested in being able to, find other things that made me tick, and that's when I discovered, public speaking. I was very fortunate to go on a course run by a professional speaker while I was still competing, which gave me an understanding of how one could do this as a vocation, and that's one thing that they share with me. So when I retired from competing and the medical team put that big red card in front of me and said, "You're done," I had irons in fires. I had other things to go into, and I was really took my time to try and understand and delve deeply into, who I was and what was important to me. Because when you're an Olympic athlete, that is who you are and what's important to you. And it becomes so inextricably linked with your identity that you actually have no idea who you are. And this is a huge, huge issue that is still going on now with the professional sports people, and one which I am very much aware of in the roles that I play, the mentoring roles in particular. And so for me, I did a values kind of exercise to kind of go, okay, so here I am at 30, what's important to me? And two values that came up were freedom and flexibility. And those were two that I never had before, because I didn't have any freedom because I chose to be in high performance sport. And that meant I trained 6 days a week, and I had a certain amount of time off, and it wasn't very much and such like. And then I used to love going to other countries to compete, but I never used to see anything but a swimming pool and a hotel. And I was like, man, the world is so big. And so I just made those important values, and then started to make my career decisions, if you will, around those. And so people often ask me, saying, Leon, so what do you do now that you're not an athlete anymore? I say, well, I hide from a real job. And I think that's the best way to describe it. So I fragmented my interests very much in the same way as when I was young and I was trying all these different sports. I became very open to new experience and finding areas that filled me with joy. And now I spend my time as a performance and wellness coach, as a speaker and a presenter, but also as a mentor. I'm still very close to sport, but as I mentioned, I teach yoga, and I'm involved in a wide variety of things, which means that freedom and flexibility is those boxes are really ticked. And the thing that I resented from elite sport was it was just so structured. And the thing that I miss the most, Lucas, is the structure. So I look at my schedule now, and it's like, oh, hang on, I can be, I need to be very mindful and aware that I'm not busy being busy, that I have a purpose to the activities I'm involved in, and they're true to what I'm, what I believe in and what's close to my heart. So yeah, it's a different challenge at this day with a movable schedule, but it's exciting, and that uncertainty provides me with a high amount of stimulation and joy.
There's a lot to be learned at the extremities, and so obviously you had extreme behavior challenges when you were younger, and you kind of found balance by going into extreme athletics, really. I mean, it's kind of the pinnacle of athleticism is Olympic athlete. For most people listening, they're not at those extremes. And so, but they still have very real challenges, meaning by 3 p.m. in the afternoon every day, they're feeling overwhelmed with all the stuff of life, or when they lay their head down on the pillow at night, they have so much anxiety and worry they can't sleep until 2 a.m. And so while it might not be the glaring red flag that your parents saw when you were young, and the solution might not be 7 hours a day of training for the Olympics.
No, definitely not.
I guess what I'm hinting at here is how to give people some framework for movement as medicine, because for me, it certainly is. If I don't do my yoga practices, I'm just not as likable. I'm not as friendly. I'm not as productive. For me, it's very, very linear, and I can see it immediately. And people who are close to me recognize it, and they, gladly excuse me from any social obligations I might have to go take care of myself. And I guess what I find is most people, we all have tools, right? And tools to manage our emotional life. And most people's tools are Haagen Dazs and Netflix and 6-pack of beer and a spliff. And, they don't have great tools. Those tools work, but they don't work as great as something that is creative, positive, forward-focused. A lot of those are really short-term fixes that end up on a downward spiral. So I'm curious how you think about this movement as medicine for like the layman, for somebody who's not a professional athlete.
Absolutely. And this was the intention of my recent TEDx. It was, when I was really wrestling with, what is my one idea worth spreading? What's the thing that's made the biggest difference to me, but to others that I've seen and observed in the fortunate area that I'm in now, where, I'm working with a breadth of people as a performance and wellness coach, and it's like, well, how do how do we create more options to get unstuck? And, the World Health Organization, have highlighted psychological stress as a global epidemic. And this leads to, not just more stress, but to maybe more serious mental health issues. And, there's lots of interventions out there. And the one that we often overlook is this thing that most of us have an ability, fortunately, to move to a certain degree. Now, we're not talking about becoming as you've said, the next Olympians. It's just taking that opportunity to get out of your head and into your body, because the precursor to stress is often overthinking. We find ourselves overthinking too much time, stuck there in this whirring pattern, and trying to think our way out of our head doesn't work. Thinking isn't necessarily the solution to most of our problems. It often is the cause to our problems. So my message was simple. It's like, well, let's get out of our heads and into our bodies, and you can do that in any way you like. So there's two actions that I believe we can all take. Is number one is just to disrupt this pattern of psychological stress. So whenever you're in a context where something triggers you, so it could be a person, a place, a thing, a context, whatever, as soon as you notice that stress response, that's a chemical response in your body, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, that's all changing. If you don't address that, that is poisoning your body. It's damaging your brain and your human nervous system. The easiest way to intervene is to physiologically move. Now, this could be as simple as standing up. If standing up isn't available, just by moving your body a little bit, maybe the shoulders back, or stretching, or just breathing differently, deeply, for a few breaths is enough just to change that chemical mix in the brain to move you from, that stress towards wellness. And if you keep doing this as part of a habitual routine, no matter what area you find yourself in, no matter where you are, you're just giving yourself a chance to not continue to poison yourself and lead into more and more psychological stress. And then the second side of it is, we need to, as I term it, find your movement. It doesn't need to be exercise. It doesn't need to be the traditional, I need to go to the gym, I need to run. It can be as creative as you like. And it doesn't need to be, one of the traditional. It could be anything. So dancing, walking, shaking, make it your own. But it does need to be regular. But the most important ingredient, whether you're a professional athlete or whether you hate athletics and sport, you need to find a movement that you enjoy, a movement that fills you with joy. And the only way you're going to find those is by going out there and trying all these different movements that are available. And you start slowly and you start simply, but whatever you choose to do, you need to put a smile on your face, because you need to set that intention before that this is actually what you're doing. And thinking of it for your mental health rather than your physical health can be actually the motivation we need. We all know that after moving physically, whether it's a beautiful yoga practice, whether it's a walk, whether it's running up the stairs, whatever it is, that we feel more ease and things are clearer after moving physically. And that's all we're trying to do, is mix up that chemical soup, that neurobiological soup in our head in such a way that makes us more resourceful and calmer and less stressed. And stress is poison. It's the chemical mix of poison in the body. And so if we can keep changing that with those two ways, intervening in the moment and finding movements that fill you with joy, and those change over time. Mine used to be high adrenaline fueled diving, and before that it was certainly swimming, and now it's my yoga practice that is most important to me. But alongside that, I still have other things that I'm now finding my joy in, different movements. And the amount of people that have been communicating with me post my TEDx saying, oh, it's this for me, it's that for me. It's amazing to hear people's personal stories of how they're finding their movement. And often now people are sending me personal messages going, I loved your TED talk and I'm just off to the gym or out for a run or going to dancing or off to do this. And it's just the way we're designed. We're designed to move, and we just need to move more.
Mistake I think that people make is compartmentalizing movement from the rest of their life. So someone will be a yoga student or a CrossFitter, or they go to Zumba, they go to some kind of dance fitness, and they don't make it to the class, so I can't do anything today. Or the place I see it the most is I take my kids to the park. All the parents sit on benches on their phones, and the kids run around. And yeah, she's like, well, why don't you just go play some ping pong, kick the ball with your kid? Like, it's very weird, but that's not what adults do. We sit on the bench and hang out on our phone. Why? Why can't you just, if you missed your Zumba class, why can't you just put on a song and move around in your kitchen? We have this very weird idea, kind of rigid ideas about when movement happens. And, people will walk in a very restricted movement pattern around the sidewalk, and then, they'll go out of their way to go to a Zumba class where for the first time all day they lift their arms above their head. So you could have done that anytime you wanted, so just giving yourself permission to move and just to do things and be active, and everybody feels better. It's just, there's extreme cases like yourself where it was definitely a massive shift that, your parents were very grateful for, but everyone feels better. I've been teaching yoga for whatever it is now, 15 years or something, and I've just it never happens where somebody comes out of a class and feels worse. Like you always feel better. And so figuring out what works for you, I think, is really important. I think that's my big takeaway from your talk and from what you've shared here today, because so often I meet people who are fixated on some specific yoga practice, some specific training regime. They want to be a triathlete or they want to be a CrossFitter. And it's like, you know what? Maybe you just need to walk your dog 5 days a week and spend an hour and indulge or whatever it is. It can really be that simple, but lack of movement is the same as this idea that I meet people a lot who don't cook, so they just eat out all the time. It's like, that's not going to work. If you want to be healthy, you have to learn how to make yourself some food. If you want to be healthy, you need to learn how to move in a way that lights you up, and it doesn't need to be extreme or structured or competitive, but it's got to happen.
Well said. I totally agree.
I appreciate you coming on the show, and I appreciate your talk and your work. For people listening who would like to follow you online, what's the best place for them to connect with you?
Yeah, certainly. So I have a love-hate relationship with social media, but I do have a presence on Twitter. But my website, as you mentioned at the beginning, so say hey to me through there. You can contact me directly from the contact page. And please, if you haven't seen my TEDx, 17 minutes, give it a watch. And if it does resonate, then please share it, because my goal is to get this message out there. And so, Lucas, I appreciate you having me on, and all the very best to you and all your listeners.
Thanks so much for your work, Leon. We'll link up in the show notes for everyone listening to the TEDx talk and to Leon's website and his book and all of those resources. Thanks so much for your work, and let's keep in touch for the future. I first started training yoga teachers in 2005, 2006 for one specific reason, and that was that we needed more staff in-house, and we couldn't find good teachers coming out of most of the yoga teacher training programs. In case you don't know, most yoga teacher training programs are like adult summer camps. You do some yoga, eat some lentils, sing some songs, and then they give you a piece of paper at the end of your course, and you are qualified to do absolutely nothing. Our course, we really needed people to work. We put them on contract as soon as they came out of the course, so we created this course structure, which is very unique and continues to be very unique to this day, in that we hire and we recruit and we actually help other studios recruit right from our training courses. So everything we do is practical, real world focused. We wanted graduates that we could hire. And it's been a huge success. When we opened the course up to the public, originally it was just invite only, it was a huge success, and our graduates went on to open their own studios, to write books, to be on television. They've done really, really well for themselves because we gave them the tools they needed to work as professionals. The Yoga Teachers College is the latest incarnation after many, many years, thousands of teachers in 41 countries, many, many years of experience. We came up with this new structure, which we couldn't be more excited about. It allows us to welcome people of all ages and all backgrounds, especially people with busy and complex lives. It's a blended course, so online and offline, with immersions in Barcelona and home study. It's a very international group of people. It's the most challenging course on the planet. It's also the most business, positive, mind-body fitness focused course that you'll find, and our trainees and our graduates are doing great. It's my biggest project to date, and I couldn't be more excited. To learn more, if you're interested in becoming a yoga teacher, or if you went to an adult summer camp for yoga to become a yoga teacher and it didn't really work out, you can come to us and we can help you get on track as well. Go to yogateacherscollege.com, yogateacherscollege.com. You'll see application information. You'll find the course syllabus, and you can learn what it is that we're doing. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. The question is, hey Lucas, how much water should you drink on a daily basis? This is something that people argue a lot about in weight loss circles. People often encourage you to drink tons of water to fill up your stomach. There's a couple of big problems with this. There's no real research to show that drinking lots of water makes you lose weight. There's not even really great research around drinking lots of water and general health. Dehydration is for sure a problem. It's usually a bigger problem because people are eating really dry food like processed foods, and they're also drinking lots of diuretics like caffeinated beverages would probably be the biggest one, and alcohol. So caffeinated beverages plus alcohol plus dry foods equals dehydration. In a situation where somebody's eating primarily a whole food diet, where they're eating natural foods, wet foods, natural foods are generally 60-70% water, sometimes even more. Dehydration is not so much of an issue. How do you know if you're dehydrated? Just look at your stools. Your bowel movement's pretty clear to see if things are dried out and if things are blocked there. In terms of how much water you should drink, it really depends on the climate. So whereas people will tend to throw out these things, drink 1 ounce per pound of body weight per day or whatever it is, these algorithms that people come up with, it's just very different if you're in a cold country in the middle of the winter or if you're on the equator in the middle of the hottest heat. It's very different. To give you an example, when I'm in Spain and Barcelona in the winter, I might drink 3 liters of water per day. When I'm in April and I'm in Thailand and it's the hot season, I literally might drink 6 liters or even more of water, especially if I'm doing a lot of yoga. So it really depends. You should drink when you're thirsty unless something has gone wrong. Water and fiber are 2 things that people tend to overdo it on, and the thought is that more is always better, and that's not necessarily true. You drink too much water, the biggest risk is not so much putting a toll on your kidneys, which can be a problem, but the bigger risk is that you dilute your stomach acid and it makes it harder to digest foods, and it can be a really big problem. If you have your stomach acids totally diluted, it can mess up your digestion, which can lead to a cascade of not major but little minor problems that can be really irritating. And with fiber, when people overdo it with fiber, same thing, you can irritate your gut lining and your whole GI tract. And the general consensus, drink more water, eat more fiber, is really only true if you're missing those items. And when you're lacking those items, it's usually, again, because of things, not because you aren't drinking water, but because you are eating and drinking things that remove the water from your body rather than put it back in. Now, all of that said, I always have a water bottle with me. I'm carrying one right now, but I don't drink obsessively like I used to, and I don't try to hit some kind of magic 8 glasses a day or 1 ounce per pound of body weight or any of these kind of formulas. I just drink until I'm not thirsty. And I actually find that not drinking before meals is really helpful for me to feel good with digestion. And so that's my biggest suggestion with water is drink as much as you need, but overdoing water, haven't seen any benefits. If anything, there's contraindicated stuff, including a little bit of tax on your system, not so worried about that, but diluting the strength of your digestive system is for sure not something that I would suggest. So that's my tip on water. Adjust based on heat, level of activity, and general thirst. Avoid diuretics like alcohol and caffeine, and drink until you're satisfied. We have a question this week from listener Ashley. Listener Ashley says, I love your podcast. I've listened to almost every available episode on iTunes. Yeah, it's kind of weird, but iTunes doesn't list all of the shows. I think they throttle it at 100 shows or something like that, which is an issue. If you want to go back and listen to all the shows, we have hundreds of them. You can always go to the main website and you will find an archive of all of them there. Hopefully we'll make them easier to download for you in the future. Carrying on. Thank you for the excellent information you share. You clearly put a lot of thought and research into your work. It's highly appreciated. Thanks, Ashley. I know you talk a lot about throttling your carbs to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight, but I'm wondering, is that total carbs or net carbs minus fiber you're referring to? So Ashley, I use really sloppy math and I don't really think about it. You can think about carbs, you can think about net carbs, which is where you get rid of the fiber. There's different kinds of carbs. There's simple carbs and there's, highly fibrous carbs. I just throw everything into one bucket and don't bother thinking about it too much. Is that an oversimplification? Absolutely it is. And I do it on purpose because food nutrition is too complicated. So what does that mean? Well, that means you can go to any sort of thing. In fact, you can just Google how many carbs in an apple and it'll give you how many. So if you're trying to calculate how many carbs you eat in a day, literally don't overthink it. Just type it into Google. How many carbs in a slice of whole wheat bread? How many carbs in a XYZ food item that you're eating? It'll come up, and I just total them all up. You can get really, really complicated with this. It's not really worth it. You just want to get somewhere within range. For those of you who don't know what Ashley's talking about, carbohydrates are the biggest problem. We just eat too many of them. There's nothing wrong with carbohydrates. They're great. They're probably essential carbs that we haven't isolated yet. That's my theory. But how many do you need? Well, if you get in the range of 1 gram of carbs per pound of ideal body weight, it usually keeps people in a really healthy metabolic range where their body composition is optimized, meaning you're not carrying a whole bunch of body fat, your hormones aren't all out of whack, your blood sugar is stable. To give you an idea what that means is, let's say your ideal body weight, when you're healthy and fit and strong, you weigh 150 pounds, you'd roughly aim for about 150 grams of carbs per day. Now, if you're training really hard, you might need more. If you're younger, you might need more. But for your average person listening to that show, that gets you within range. If you're under eating carbs, you'll know right away. Meaning if you're just not getting enough carbohydrates, you start getting too lean or too thin. That's a really easy problem to fix. You don't need a guy like me to tell you how to put on weight. Second part of the question, I was wondering, what are your thoughts on a ketogenic diet, which I believe restricts carbs to about 50 total grams per day? I know you advocate intermittent fasting and high healthy fat consumption, so I'd just be curious to hear more on your thoughts about ketosis specifically. I first got into ketosis many years ago. I was diagnosed with a seizure disorder, not exactly epilepsy, but seizure tendency. Ketosis is something that's been used for many, many decades to treat seizures naturally. I thought it might help with my cognitive function, just my general neurological health, and it did. It does for most people. So I got really curious about it. This is a long time ago, long before keto diets became popular. So back in 99, 2000, I was experimenting with super high fat. I was eating mostly disgusting high cream coffee. Ironically, that's back in it's in fashion suddenly. But in terms of getting into ketosis, it's surprisingly hard. Most of the keto websites, keto blogs, keto whatever you see out there, those people aren't really in ketosis. They think they are, but they're not. You need to eat less than 80 grams of carbs per day. For many people, yeah, like you mentioned, Ashley, 50 or less grams of carbs per day. When you get into that range, you will feel it. You will feel weird and you will feel uncomfortable for most people. Not everybody. Some people feel great. What do I think about ketosis? Super interesting. Therapeutically, great benefit. Seems like something that our bodies were designed to do. This is why periods of fasting can be really important, especially for cellular autophagy, for the cleansing out of old cells, cancer prevention, longevity. Probably not something you should be doing long term. The long-term results of a ketogenic diet are totally unknown. Probably some really negative stuff going on there. Ketosis is a natural state you would dip in and out of on a pretty regular basis. The example I always give is young children. Very common for a young child, like let's say a 4-year-old, to fall asleep at 7 o'clock at night, wake up 12 hours later, and then not eat anything for another hour or two. So that full 12, 13, 14-hour fast. Go to that child and smell their breath, and you'll smell acetone on their breath. It smells a little bit like almost like slightly rotten applesauce. Not exactly offensive, but not exactly fresh breath either. That is a byproduct of ketones in their system. This happens to children all the time. As adults, we suddenly think that it's healthy to put food down our throat every waking moment, and so we eat for 18 of 24 hours or 20 of 24 hours. Is just way too much. So going into ketosis on a semi-regular basis seems like a really, really natural and really healthy thing, especially considering that children are doing it all the time. Forced ketosis, less than 50 grams of carbs per day, probably not a great way to go. Intermittent fasting, also people get a little carried away with. Who knows what happens if you starve yourself that much, but to actually have a break before you eat in the morning is a really great advice. We generally start with 12-hour turnaround as your baseline. So that means if your last meal was at 8, you wait till at least 8 in the morning before you have something. If you can push that to 14 hours of a break, great. 16 hours is really where you start to make massive changes, which may or may not be needed depending on where you are. Third part of the question. Lastly, kind of an unrelated note, I'm in the middle of a level 1 Kundalini teacher training in Los Angeles. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on Kundalini yoga versus other forms of yoga that you practice and teach. Kundalini yoga was founded by, it's a Sikh practice, sort of a modern version of Sikh, Yogi Bhajan, and the same guy, if you go to Yogi Tea in the stores, you'll find that really interesting, pretty controversial movement of yoga. The yoga system was developed specifically to attract people to Sikhism. Very, very strong community and very good at business. They built these really big industries, a whole bunch of different industries all around the globe. And Yogi Bhajan was quite a dynamic leader. Never met him. He passed away long ago. And I've never been very involved with Kundalini yoga. I have been to Kundalini classes, workshops. I even did a short training course. Never really resonated with me. The white robes and the excessive breath of fire practices kind of put me off. I'm just so anti-establishment. It's very difficult for me. At the same time, can't deny all the positive things that Kundalini Yoga has done. Tons and tons of respect and tons of cool people I know from those communities. It's not really my thing, but it's pretty interesting, and they do some interesting stuff socially. Yogi Bhajan's a really controversial figure. He did tons of stuff to fight for women's rights, and then he's had a whole bunch of sort of Me Too scandal stuff that's come out as well. I don't know yes or no, anything in between. All of those things are hearsay. I don't know, but definitely some suspicious and creepy stuff in the past history there. In terms of Kundalini Yoga, if it's working for you, go for it. The only thing I will warn you against is these extended breath of fire practices where you will do controlled hyperventilation. It sounds like this. For like an hour on the beach with your arms extended. There's a real risk of anxiety attacks, and it's a significant minority of people, like 10% of people get totally overwhelmed. It can trigger PTSD, it can trigger anxiety attacks. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. There's lots of things that can trigger anxiety attacks, including Hollywood movies, but it is something you should be aware of because it happens all the time. I get really triggered by those hyperventilation things. I get headaches and I can get triggered with anxiety, so I'm not a huge fan of those long breath of fire practices that are often associated with Kundalini, but there's plenty of people who aren't doing that. With the yoga practices, I always say whichever one you like the best, that's the one you should be doing. So if you're getting a lot from that community and that practice, keep going with it. It's definitely an interesting organization.
This week's iTunes review is by Zim Tiff from the US. Zim Tiff says, I love this podcast. Heard about it through Lucas's interview with Brett Larkin on the Yoga Hacks podcast and am now an avid listener. Health and wellness is very important to me, and this is my go-to source of inspiring and motivating information on all things health, wellness, and yoga. Zim, you have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we will ship it to you.
If you're a regular Yoga Talk Show listener, you'll definitely want to get on my email list. Go to yogabody.com/sign me up. When you enter your email address there, we always have free giveaways every month, yoga straps, water bottles, discounts in our shop, and all kinds of other things. When you sign up at yogabody.com/sign me up, I'll send you just one email a week with updates about the show, special offers, new courses, and valuable information that I think you'll find useful. So go to yogabody.com/sign me up to claim your free prize now.